Hello and welcome to another Atypical Philosopher video with myself, Jonathan M.S. Pearce. I'm really excited today to be talking to a guest. I do lots of lives, and those who know my channel know it's kind of schizophrenic, and I have my philosophy side of things and I have my Ukraine war side of things, and the two don't particularly meet, although there is a really interesting philosophical discussion to be had about the morality of this kind of war. But this is my first live guest that I've had to do with the Ukraine war, and so I'm really excited about that. His name is Tim White, and I follow him avidly on Twitter, and I advise you do as well. Here he is on Twitter. So his handle is, let's have a look, TWMC Limited. So check him out there. That's Tim White. And here he is with me today. So Tim, welcome along. Thanks for agreeing to come on.
Honored to be your first live guest, Jonathan. Pleased to be here. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you. Well, not my first live guest, my first live Ukraine war guest, which is this particular area that we're talking about. Okay, so give us a little bit of background of how you've got so interested in the Ukraine war and how you've ended up where you are at the moment.
Long story, but it goes back a long way actually into my childhood, and I was always mildly obsessed with Eastern Europe. And actually, you say there's a little bit of a crossover between philosophy and the war. My early philosophical thoughts as a young boy were, why are we always so suspicious of the Soviet Union as it was then, and will they be as suspicious and distrusting of us? And so it was always one of my low-key ambitions, if you like, to travel there and see for myself what people thought of Westerners. And then I became interested in literature from around the world, and I was particularly impressed with, let's call them Russian, not Soviet authors, Russian authors. And Dostoevsky, whose politics I certainly won't agree with, but was a fabulous writer. I certainly admire Pushkin. And there are also many great Ukrainian writers as well, not least of which Lesya is just a heroine, and I think also Taras Shevchenko, the national poet, writes some wonderful stuff. So there's a whole real culture, Slavic culture, that I wanted to investigate. I wanted to go and see for myself. And then I was fortunate enough to be in Ukraine and be asked to help in Ukraine as they try to reform their education system, particularly through one let's say strident, very advanced university in its thinking, and that was the world famous Mohila Academy. And I became very close friends with some people there, working now on and off with them for over 20 years, to be honest. And they wanted to reform from the Soviet system into a Western style system. So we had to go through, I mean, basically in those days, you just bought any sort of degree. If your father or mother were rich, you got into the university you wanted, and thereafter you got the marks you wanted by further payments. There was not much of a meritocracy going on. You had to be extremely good to be poor and to be able to get through to the upper echelons of Soviet and then Russian society after the 1990-91 implosion of the Soviet Union. So I was helping out at the very start of the 21st century, and teaching them things, simple things like the bell curve of those who are in education, whereby not so many get the very top grade, and then the majority of people get, in our university terms, 2 1s, 2 2s, and then not so many thirds, and hopefully very few fails. But none of that was even existent. They didn't have a clue about that. And we were teaching them broadcast techniques as well. I was particularly involved in broadcasting and journalism, teaching journalism. And we trained students who then, the idea was that they would become the trainers themselves. And indeed they did, and became a very, very successful course. Incidentally, at the time when we were first doing this, one of our students then became the official spokesperson for the 2004 revolution, the first peaceful revolution, the first time we saw a tented city on Maidan in Kiev. And when Yushchenko was robbed of the election, and then astonishingly the public came out in their hundreds of thousands, millions on the street, and the Soviet system was finally proven to be broken when the courts said there must be a rerun of the election, and the correct result was established that Yushchenko had obviously clearly won the first election, clearly won the rerun, and democracy probably for the first time in reality, with an open election, with pretty open media, was able to flourish in Ukraine. And thereafter, I've kept in touch. I've been over so many times. My passport is littered with stamps of Ukraine. I think we're up to about 70 visits now. Unfortunately, I haven't been back since the few days before war broke out. I've had invitations. It's incredibly difficult getting insurance, especially if you're working over there. But I do hope to go back and make another documentary soon. Not everything is right in Ukraine, as I've tried to be pointed out for a long time. There's still a lot of Russian influence, even these days, inside the bits of Ukraine that are, or the majority of Ukraine, I should say, that is still controlled from Kiev and from the central government. There's still a lot of internecine warfare between different parties and different politics. There's still a lot of oligarch influence. So Ukraine is along the road to democracy, not fully at the end goal by
there's a corruption index, isn't there, where Ukraine is really not looking good, but there has been improvement. I mean, the important thing is there's been improvement. So when people are very pro-Ukraine because they see Russia perhaps as the pure aggressor in this situation, it's sometimes easy to forget that Ukraine does have its own problems. You kind of, whitewash Ukraine as being some kind of victim and nothing other than a victim, and with no problems of its own. But there are problems of corruption, and even the West say, look, if you're going to give money, do it through these sources, because actually, if it goes through these sources, there's a great chance it's going to get lost. And so there are things that will have to be reformed, I guess, going forward.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think most Ukraine watchers, hopefully most foreign officials, do realize, as you said, Jonathan, that there is still some undesirable people, and they will be getting some money, some relief, some weapons. But hopefully it's a case of education, and they see that when the West really is supportive and how society can flourish, that hopefully even these people will change their ways and become more acceptable, I suppose is one word, but cut down on the crime, cut down on the corruption. When I was first over there in my early days, everyone was against corruption, but very few people would vote for an end to corruption because they were kind of all involved. And I see that now in Russian society, where people who are not comfortably off, not very well off, but surviving, are worried that if their mothers or fathers get ill, that they won't be able to pay for the better treatment if it's an end of corruption. And so they're all kind of involved at some level. And the people who are in management roles were put there often with at least some nepotism or some corruption element, and they're worried for their jobs. And the ones above them are even more afraid that they're going to get bumped off, or worse, arrested or killed or maimed by the even more powerful oligarchs and the influence of the corrupt parts of government. So there was an unwillingness to change this system. It's taken a long time, a generation now, before we've got to the situation where most young people in Ukraine are not tolerant at all of corruption. And that's really been the driving force for a really big social revolution alongside the war that's taking place.
Has that been a sort of the ramifications of a generation that is now starting to be brought up in a more globalized society? So this was all left over from the Soviet kind of historical cultural background that Ukraine has had, and the corruption that kind of goes with that. And that's not to say there isn't corruption in the free market system, that there isn't corruption in Western systems. Of course there is, but it's about orders of magnitude of difference, maybe, and maybe different types of corruption. But do you think this is just a case of the tide turning with a new globalized generation coming along?
Yes, definitely. And I think that Russia is afraid of that, which is why it has virtually shut down access to anything it considers undesirable, in quotes. I think there's a big influence that Poland has had here, because at the time that Poland joined the EU, Ukraine was a richer country, arguably, certainly producing a lot more, and was generally seen as a healthier, or at least as healthy, depending on whose point of view you take, as Poland. And Poland under the EU has absolutely flourished, as any statistics will show you. It's very hard to counter that argument. And Ukraine, everything, all indicators of production, particularly, of course, because a lot of the territory was seized after even 2013-14 by Russia. But all the GDP, all the normal statistics we use have shown that Ukraine hasn't been advancing as quickly as Poland and is way behind in GDP and stuff like that now. And a lot of people in Ukraine have realized that, hold on a minute, we're working as hard, we're in arguably better growing conditions, we have the brains, we have a lot of people working abroad. Why on earth isn't Ukraine doing as well as Poland? And the umbrella of the EU, the trading, the lack of hindrance from being held back by the old Soviet thinking and the old Soviet rulers, and the sheer corruption have been things that the younger generation have particularly been aggravated by and see a better future ahead. Firstly, without Russia's influence, and secondly, within the EU.
I read a book recently, Anne Applebaum, Twilight of Democracy, The Failure of Politics and the Parting of Friends. Really good book. Absolutely loved it. She's living, I don't know if she's still living in Poland, but she had a lot to say with some of the failures of Poland in terms of, and the failures of the democratic institutions of Poland and other places like Hungary and in fact America, talking about how democracy is under threat. And we need to support it in these places like the US, like the EU, like Britain, that are suffering with an attack on our democratic institutions, because this is so important, especially in light of what can go wrong when you look at, Russia and Ukraine striving for these democratic ideals. But if they're striving for these ideals in these places where these ideals are under threat, you've got a bit of a tension. I don't know. Thought I'd throw that in.
Yeah, absolutely. It's another great philosophical point, isn't it, to go back to one of your main raison d'etres, Jonathan. And to a lesser extent, people can throw in, well, probably to a greater extent, in some extents, Bolsonaro, but closer to home, of course, stateside. I know you've got a lot of followers in the US, a lot of people seeing similarities in Trump and in the UK to how Boris reacted, and the fear that control would be centralized to one person, albeit in the UK we're in a parliamentary democracy and we elect a party rather than a leader, as has been proven a few times over the summer and into autumn now, of course. But yet there is a real worry that there's too much power in the hands of one person or one party, but that party being ruled singularly by strict decree, if you like, in Hungary and in Poland. And some of the decisions, notably the one that's got a lot of people in Poland aggravated, the abortion laws. And we're seeing a similar thing in the US at the moment, and threat to that, aren't we, with Roe v. Wade? So it's always, I think, incumbent on the good people not to turn a blind eye, for the people who haven't been politically active to be active, for the people to come to the streets, as the people of Ukraine did, and immense pressure in 2003 when they came out to support students who were beaten in the early days. And I was there on that late November night, early December, and again on December the 10th, as memory recalls, when the army, the Berkut, the savage police came out just to beat protesters and try and, as they saw it, restore control. But the people rose up and with non-violent means, they protested in the streets, and they made it impossible for the government to ignore. And it's up to the people, the decent people of Hungary and Poland, to say when they've had enough. And if that is their leaders going too far, the EU rather, can put certain pressure on and threaten to withhold funds, as we've seen with Hungary. Is it a leader doing it for the good of the country as they see? Is it a leader doing something for the short term because of their own political aspirations and seeing how easy it will be to get cheaper gas? Or is it that they're trying to line their own pockets and ally themselves with Russia purely for selfish reasons? It's for the people to decide.
I mean, you get these great indicators that happened with Orban in Poland, which is shutting down the press. So, okay, the press are able to criticize me. I need to, infringe upon their rights, and so therefore it's a shutdown of the press. And then you look at Russia, and then you look at the shutdown of the free press, and it's great to hear that Echo is opening up again in Berlin as a free Russian press source, and apparently the app in Russia is now starting to get very popular, so that Russians are being able to access Russian-speaking free press. But you get, you look at, I'm sure you have seen it, because I've seen you comment on the clips, those terrible, like Julia Davis, who translates those pieces of Russian television, and just the abject moral abhorrence of the views of some of these people, and these are pre-recorded, like, often, so it's not as if they're like, oh, they've accidentally said this, let's shut them down. It's like, no, we've sanctioned this. They've said these morally reprehensible things because this is how we're feeling. This is like fascistic culture, and Ukraine is a place of otherization, and these are subhuman others, and that pervades through like the state-sanctioned media in Russia, and then will trickle down, one assumes, to the views of the people in the wider public.
Yeah, absolutely. It's still very much state-controlled. Echo's got quite a good name, I think, really, because unfortunately it's a bit of an echo chamber. It is preaching to the converted, those who already know, those who have free minds, the cognoscenti that has already either fled Russia. A lot of their listeners and subscribers were already outside of the country. And of course, it serves a purpose for Putin, for the Kremlin, to say, look, there is some opposition in the country. I mean, now that's pretty much all been swept away, and they were forced to close, and the way that new laws were passed just made it impossible for almost any free media to survive. And only those with the smallest audiences are still permitted, but even they are being charged, the owners, the editors, journalists, and threatened regularly. So there's nothing like a free media, and it is still a worry. The opening of Echo reopening is not going to change anything, I'm afraid, and it needs well, we've seen that's as a journalist, that's why it's so close to my heart, that you can predict the future by seeing what is happening, and any trampling of the rights of people to report freely, any hindrance, any pressure that's being brought to bear on organizations, journalists, any buying up of popular newspapers, TV stations like that, are a clear warning for any democracy.
That's where I was going with that. I mean, what's going on with Orban is just is a clearer indicator, as you want, that Hungary is going in the direction of Russia, and that's not a good thing. So moving over to Russia directly and Putin, what do you think? So right at the beginning, back in February the 24th, wasn't it? Well, what do you think? Putin got it wrong. He got it completely wrong, because he went in there thinking there's going to be a 2-day deposing of the Ukrainian government, and then 15 days to clear it up with his Rosgvardia, the military police. They've got parade uniforms in their vehicles. They're not equipped for a full war. They're just like, this is going to happen really quickly. We'll be welcomed with open arms and flowers. And we've got maps to show we've got plans to show that this is going to last 15 days. And then it doesn't straight away, because the Ukrainians are like, hey, this is our country, like, go away. And so how do you explain what happened there?
Well, it must have been an absolutely monumental failure of intelligence, and we've seen some pretty swift changes from Putin in that regard. Obviously, he still has great sympathies with the FSB, but some of the institutions in Russia have been absolutely shambolic. I mean, stretching back to Salisbury, and the way that Bellingcat has exposed so many embarrassing tales. Really, frankly, it's like kids doing spying at times. But to get back to the point in question, it's really impossible to understand how anyone could even conceive of Ukraine giving in with only a mild fight, because anyone who's been there knows the absolute detestation of not just Putin, but Russia's aggression, Russia's army. Most people have lived through it, or lived through the beatings of the Berkut in 2014 rather, and the first revolution in 2004. So it's not as if the warning signs weren't there for Russia. They also knew that Ukraine had Western training, and they knew that there was a lot of Western intelligence being shared with Ukraine, limited, but enough. Maybe they were surprised that Zelensky didn't take much preventive action. He was probably surprised that a lot had actually been going on behind the scenes, but the public was still told the day before that there would be no attack from Russia, and people were still drinking happily. I left the country, I think, 3-4 days before the invasion began, something like that, maybe a few more days. But when the warnings were absolutely apparent, and the Foreign Office was telling us that we had to leave Ukraine. And so it came to pass. The intelligence was correct, and Russia's intelligence was incredibly lacking. Probably I guess he thought that our might, Putin, would probably thought that our might, even if there is some resistance, would soon overcome it. But maybe in the south, there was more of a worry from Ukraine that would happen. There's a lot more corruption, pro-Russian influence in the southern states, those which he's now pretended to annex. But Kiev was just a pipe dream. It was impossible. Even had they reached the city center, there would have been catastrophic loss of life on both sides, but of Russian troops, because of the urban warfare that would have occurred. And all Ukrainians were well prepared for that. I mean, I've got friends there, and I know they were absolutely prepared to fight to the death for their lives, for their property, for their neighbors, for their friends. It was an absolutely unified, and still is, determined society against a few people not really knowing why they're fighting, not really wanting to be there, most of them.
That's such a big, that's a really big point, isn't it? That the Ukrainians have something to fight for. They're fighting for their family, their homeland, their national pride. And the Russians seem to be fighting for, I don't know, Putin's narcissism or some kind of idea of Russian imperialism. But it's not the sort of thing that will drive you to go somewhere else and kill, or shouldn't be driving you to go and, kill using abject violence, people in their own homeland. So there's this disparity between conviction amongst the people fighting.
That's why fake news is so important, because it has been used to brainwash the Russian people. Right from my first documentary that I made was looking at fake news, and even then mentioning how Russian media just completely made up the story of a boy being crucified in Western Ukraine for speaking Russian. It was complete nonsense and completely made up. But there was a huge rush of people volunteering to fight in the Russian armies, in the pseudo-Russian armies, in the militia in the Donbass region, off the back of that story that was carried by national state channels, and a whole host of other stories, and this portrayal, this constant daily bombardment about how Ukrainians are Nazis. And the facts just don't matter. They're just absolute lies on top of lies. And every day it seeps into the Russian psyche. And a lot of people absolutely believe that there are, practically Hitlers walking on the street, and all these people are ridiculously right wing. When if they look at any election result, there's not a single right-wing member has made the cutoff to be represented in.
No, in fact, there's been some interesting analysis. Ross, someone on the BBC, did a great segment, 10-minute segment on this right at the beginning, where Azovstal Steelworks was holding out, but there's still this idea in Western media that the Azov battalion are still kind of Nazi-ish and this, and he did a really good segment to say, look, you look at the electoral results for Ukraine, and it appears that there's less support for like fascistic politics in Ukraine than in like most other parts in Europe. It's like, don't as Europeans or Americans or whoever have a go and believe this narrative that Ukraine has got significant Nazis in it, when the results just don't reflect that. And the Azov battalion is a changed thing, and though there might be the odd element here or there, that is the same of every other country in the world. In fact, it appears less than every other country in the world, type thing.
Yeah, there is. I mean, when I first started going, racism was pretty appalling and quite shocking, and probably on about the same level as I experienced when I went to Russia. But it's become a lot less. There's still a lot of misogyny. It's still a very sexist society, but not among the younger generation. It's really cleaned up its act as Ukraine significantly, noticeably, and hopefully now people of color are not going to be intimidated or subject to much abuse, and as you say, probably no more than they would be at times in the UK, in Germany, in France, and maybe the US. There are always idiots in every country. There are always despicable people, but Ukraine has incredibly quickly really turned things around. And if you think about how the UK was in the 1970s, I'm speaking from Britain now, I'm British, and how the UK progressed, say, to the year 2000, a huge change in 30 years. And Ukraine has had more or less 15, 20 years to start moving down that path. And they're a little bit behind in some respects, as they have been, the whole of the Soviet world has been. But Ukraine's made huge advancements, as did Georgia when it broke away from the yoke of the Soviet Union at around the same time as Ukraine. Go on.
I mean, well, I was just interested in, because you talked about I mean, people believing the fake news of the Soviet propaganda that there's Nazis or whatever in Ukraine, you still got the Donbass region where you've got people who were supporting Russia. And I'm not interested, and I've never really got to the bottom of this, really how much support is in how much Ukrainian support of Russia there is, like percentage wise, and where that's obviously that's concentrated more over to the east of Ukraine. But that's a problem. And is that just a case of, I don't know, some kind of cultural heritage is still remaining in families that've got strong Russian ties? Is it because somehow they've been a victim to propaganda more? I don't know. Can you speak to that at all?
I think a mix of all those. Okay, for a start, the Russian language law didn't help. I think it was one of the biggest mistakes. It didn't ban Russian, and it tried to make Ukraine the sole important language, but Russian was still able to be spoken, as was Hungarian over in the west, in the region that borders Hungary. But I learned Russian, not well, but I can get by in it because of my journeys throughout Eastern Europe. It was easier to learn one language, and I had just a few words of Ukrainian. I was never, ever looked at disparagingly. I was never questioned, apart from one time in Lviv when they just politely said to me, please speak English, not Russian. And so I did so. So language has never been a problem. The menus were still all in Russian, English, and Ukrainian until even 2-3 years ago. I think that's completely changed now. Getting back to Donbass region in particular, it's easy to forget just almost how there almost wasn't a border at times, how many people just flowed across the border, how many people had relatives in Russia who were in the Donbass, and how many people in Russia came across and had relatives in Ukraine. And now those families are largely very divided in opinion and outlook, but not all. A lot of the people, of course, who were pro-Russian fled immediately. So if you had an election now, a referendum, same as in Crimea, it could well go in favor of Russia because they've repopulated, as they did in the Stalin days when they tried to get rid of, well, they did get rid of all the native Tatar people from Crimea. So a lot has been going on there to shift the change. But even in Crimea, there was never, in independent polling leading right up to 2013, an outright majority that wanted to join Russia. Far from it, never anywhere near. Most people were happy with the status quo. A few said it should become a fully fledged part of Ukraine, and more people said it should become a fully fledged part of Russia. And that included polling in Sevastopol, which was almost completely Russian, where the Russian fleet was. A lot of Russian people lived. Donbass, it was split in both Donetsk and in Luhansk. Exact figures, really difficult to tell, but most people there watched Russian media. They didn't watch Ukrainian media. I think, if anything, Ukraine probably retrospectively now should have looked back and should have had more influential channels in Russian broadcasting and tried to reach out more. A lot of mistakes have been made by all parties, but it's about education, and it really needed to be stronger and is being tightened up now. And the only way that we will change people's minds ultimately in Russia, if we are going to get to a situation where Russia could be welcomed back into the world fold, is through education. I'm a firm, massive believer in that.
It seems to be the answer to most, global problems, doesn't it? Here's someone saying, listen to the interviews that go on one particular channel. It's incredible that Russian people believe what Russian people believe from Russian media. There's this element, and we've heard about this right from the beginning of the war, that people have phoned their relatives back in Russia, and their relatives would not believe their own brothers and sisters making claims about, well, there are bombs landing, like my apartment's been blown. I don't believe you. I'm believing Russian state media. The power and the hold that the internal security and the Russian state propaganda machine have over the Russian population is quite something.
It's incredible, isn't it? I mean, how on earth can you not believe your own daughter or son ringing you and saying, and crying and screaming and saying our house has been bombed, and for a parent to respond with, "You're lying. There's nothing happening. I'm watching it on the news now live." How does a human mind come to that state with your own flesh and blood? It just shows the power, the total power of brainwashing. And we can't call it anything else, Jonathan. It is pure brainwashing, day in, day out, including the indoctrination at schools, which is why I go back to my point about education. I remember very early Vladimir Klitschko talking about how his first visit to the United States and how they were all pretty terrified because every day they'd been brought up to sing the Soviet anthem and how the great terror was the United States. And then suddenly they were being allowed to go to the US and they were really scared, he said. And then they arrived, it was like paradise and the truth was out and the cork was out of the bottle. And I think that's how it is now for a lot of Ukrainians. But that situation is far from being achieved in Russia, as we've seen, sadly. People still believing the absolute nonsense that's put in them day in, day out.
And it doesn't help that there's more internal security members and army, personnel inside the inside of the borders of Russia, and so that grip that Putin has on his own population means that it's very unlikely that there would be a revolt. Because I want to go back to this idea. So Putin invaded, right, but based on terrible intelligence, somehow terrible. I mean, I think that decision will go down. Honestly, think it will go down as possibly one of the worst decisions in history, certainly in living memory, because it was just mind-bogglingly bad. So he's committed himself to this war. He thought there's going to be this deposing of the government, sends the troops in. It turns out that's not the case. So now he's accidentally, if you like, involved in a war. And he has to like retrospectively justify this. But so I wrote back in April, I wrote this article, which is, I think it's April. Yeah, back at April the 4th. Where to now, Putin? Because there's no way you can win, right? And I gave details of everything that had happened up to that point in April, and just said, well, here are the options he's got, but none of the options give him a win, an off-ramp, a way out of this. So, and I've reread that article now, I don't know, 5 months later or so, and it's still on point. It's absolutely on point that we're still at this position, and I'd like your opinion on this position where I see that there is literally no way Putin can win. There is no off-ramp, which is why there hasn't been an off-ramp, because actually he just can't leave this with his head held high at all. There's just no winnable scenario.
No, it's a question of goal setting, isn't it? And the original plan wasn't clear to the Russian people. And then clearly when they started attacking Kiev, the thought of just protecting or just making sure that Donetsk and Luhansk, which had just been at that time accepted into the Russian Federation, would be secure. Well, that was completely shattered because they were going in all over. And it was obvious to any strategist and any even passing reader of the situation that they were desperate to get a land bridge to Crimea, that there were all sorts of worries about the water supply, which have been going on for years. And so their real aim was to get at least to Crimea and therefore take Kherson Oblast, which, as we know, they did fairly comfortably initially with a lot of help from some corrupt people and a lot of people fleeing. But I think that the major strategic goal that I wrote about as well was spreading their resources ridiculously thinly. And the fact that they attacked Kiev from day one and other major cities as well meant that the EU and the US, the UK, all immediately woke up and started doing what they should have done back in 2013-14, because it was let me take another route. Had Putin decided to just completely invade and obliterate the whole of Donetsk and Luhansk, they would have taken those oblasts completely, very quickly. They could have maybe simultaneously or thereafter pushed through from Crimea, so that they're concentrating forces in just one area at a time and expanded to take the whole of the south. And little by little, the EU, particularly some members, okay, let's name them, France and Germany, would probably have been more reticent to take action, saying, oh, well, it's only the Donbass, and that was kind of, I guess, heading that way anyway. And then, well, Crimea, Kherson, are we going to get into a war over Kherson? And the way that Hitler did it was little by little, and not invading a country the size of Ukraine in one go all at once. I mean, it took part, Sudetenland and Austria was quite welcoming in some respect with the Anschluss. So certain similarities drawn between the two, but I think that was a huge strategic mistake as well, probably off the back of the intelligence that we talked about earlier. Had he set the goal for just the Donbass and completed that, and then moved the goalposts and said, well, we need to protect Crimea because...
So I guess it's, so you're saying like take what they already had but add to it and then nibble away and then just be more forceful with Luhansk and Donetsk, the entirety of those oblasts, and then
as you said in your article, that because he tried to get everything at once, there is no off-ramp, because it was obvious to the people of Russia, particularly the quite influential now war bloggers, for want of a different expression, and the Wagnerites as well, that they failed to take Kiev. And what's more, they failed to hold Kharkiv, where it's so close to the Russian border. For those who don't know it, there's a huge Russian influence. During the 2013 revolution, I had friends in Kharkiv who just ended up not speaking to me. They were so anti-Maidan. The same to some extent in Dnipro, and which is more central and a little bit further west, and Odessa as well. So to not being able to even take or hold these places, particularly Kharkiv, was seen as a huge blow. They got close, they got into fighting in the city center, and then were pushed back, and they've eventually lost pretty much the whole of that oblast or region. And it's, as you said, just made Putin think, what is my escape route? How can I declare a victory now? Because it's all about declaring a victory and another military achievement. And the way when any leader is struggling or has an internal power battle or an external one with the people against him, which didn't appear to be the case at that time, is to resort to military action to engender nationalism. And it's been used, some would even argue that Maggie Thatcher profited from it in the Falklands when things weren't going particularly well. And so it's not just Russia, it's not just militaristic states, as we like to call them, that do this. But yeah, it was a huge mistake. And now the off-ramp, it's difficult to see what one is, because he's now got even bigger problems. The Institute for the Study of War has talked today, that I've referred to from the interview yesterday with the Ukraine intelligence chief, about the problems that Putin has now with his friend and ally Prigozhin, but how he's undermining the state as a whole, as it were, in an independent way, and that with the Ministry of Defense being undermined and criticized openly, clearly causes huge problems for Putin. And there have been long rumors that he was going to sack Shoigu, who's still there, the Russian Minister of Defense, and he will have some power. I'm not sure he's entirely popular with the Russian military, but for sure he won't have got there without a lot of power and a lot of backing. And the fact he hasn't been removed probably states just how much of an influence he may still have within the military and other circles within the Kremlin. And so Putin does have a problem now. And short of taking in the entirety the 4 states that he's tried to claim, I don't think there's any hope for him to draw any sort of border. And the fact that the Wagnerites have put defensive lines in way behind where the current front line is, again, kind of shows that they're almost
defensively minded. Yeah, I mean, I think it's really interesting to see, because one of the observations that's been made about Putin and his regime is that he has a very narrow pillar of power, which is saying often you'd have like a pyramid or a triangle of power where you have quite a lot of people under you, and it kind of goes out like that, and there are people vying to take over from you because there are lots of Brutuses ready to stab you in the back. But Putin has been very careful to get rid of anyone, like over a long period, to get rid of anyone who would remotely challenge him. And the people he does have around him, like Shoigu, are very much not people who would take over. You can imagine Shoigu as president. So when you get someone like Prigozhin who comes along, who's now like, you know, they're creating a schism within the Kremlin, maybe within, you know, you've got his Wagner group, and then you've got the military, and the Wagner appear to be doing better than the military. And then he's sort of, maybe he's positioning himself to become new defense minister, but then could this be a threat to Putin? Because there's just been a lack of threat to Putin. That is a way of allowing Putin to sustain himself. And he's made that scenario himself, of course.
Yeah, he's portrayed himself, and has been portrayed by some sympathizers, as a master strategist, which has been undone completely since February. But it has been an incredibly smart, long-term operation, the likes of which, you know, no one in the West can plan singularly their own future in politics for 20 years, because it's democracy.
Apart from Xi Jinping. But then that's not democracy.
Yeah. But that's the same thing. You go about dismantling democracy, dismantling the free press, as we talked about earlier, making it a completely state-run society with almost no objection, and then you go about, or at the same time, picking off any potential threats, as we saw with Hodorkovsky very early on. Now quite a prominent voice in exile, but how many people is his channel reaching and his party reaching? Very few. And Navalny, slightly more high profile, got a bit further down the road towards influence with huge numbers of visitors and viewers, but how many of those were actually inside Russia? I'm not so sure. Yeah, there's a big following, but we've seen what's happened to him, and the response has been something that they could quite easily deal with, the security forces. And as you said, he's just only promoted the weak, the not smart enough, as I see it. And it means that you have a firmer grip on power, but it means also you don't have the brains that you need to tackle, for instance, a full-scale war in a neighboring peaceful country.
Yeah, and as we said already, you can see this happening in Orban. Orban is just taking the leaf out of the Chinese and the Russian book here and applying it to Hungary. And you know, all I could say for viewers out there is, you know, watch out for the organs of democracy. Don't let them be poisoned. Don't let them be extracted, because those organs of democracy, when they've gone, you find you've got nothing. Whether that's a free media to be able to report what you like, you know, people like me being able to say this and you being able to say this online is representative of the countries we live in, and the ability to you know, put heat on our ruling classes.
And I think we do need to point out at this point, Jonathan, just how much Russian influence has been in trying to infiltrate, how much Russian money has been used to try and back extremists in society of democracies, left, right. It didn't matter. There was no ideology for the Kremlin. It was purely about trying to make sure there were divisions in society, that the EU would be split, that the UK would be split. They were delighted when the UK left the EU, then realized, oh, actually, the UK is still very influential at the moment and still a very powerful figure and still is supporting the EU in so many regards, and vice versa. But the division was there. They want Scotland to be independent without a doubt. They were supporting Le Pen in her campaign tacitly. And of course, even though a Russian bank has stopped bankrolling her, as you've mentioned, guess who's bankrolling her now? A Hungarian bank. And we don't really know the extent of that. It's supposed to be a loan that we've paid back. Will it ever be? We don't know what's being given under the counter. We know what's happened with Cambridge Analytica and some murky dealings there as well. So it was, again, part of this incredibly long-term strategy from Putin to try to make sure he had no opposition, and then to undermine the West and all foes as he saw it. And he was fairly successful. And dare we say it, you know, Corbyn had very sympathetic views in the UK to the Soviet Union and to Russia, its legacy, and to Putin, and was just very strongly anti-NATO and tacitly pro-Russian for a long time, and only really changed his mind directly before the election. And I don't believe for a moment he really changed his line. It was just he knew it was the only possible way he could limit the damage of his pro-Russian leanings. And for sure, Russia was absolutely delighted that Corbyn was elected as leader of the Labour Party.
Well, the Russians have done such a good job of changing their approach to war to one of influence. So in the Cold War, you had like spending money on hardware, people, boots on the ground, hardware, boots on the ground. And it's like, hang on, if we just fill a bunch of apartment blocks with people on computers, we can influence America and Britain and the EU far more than we can influence them with a bunch of bombs. And it's a damn sight cheaper. And so it's really interesting that was the way forward. And then it just seems that they've accidentally ended up in this war because they just so grossly miscalculated. So to change slightly, what do you think NATO should have done that they haven't done so far, or members of the West or the Allies?
Well, the biggest mistake the UK and the US made, and therefore NATO as well, excuse me, to my mind, was not to completely honour and try to whitewash the Budapest Memorandum. Now, that was an agreement, for those who don't know what we're talking about, where Ukraine gave up all its nuclear arsenal, the third biggest in the world at the time, to have its state borders guaranteed from any invasion or any pressure threat, for instance. And that was mainly at the behest of Russia, of the Ukrainians, to ensure that the West and the UK the US didn't invade and they'd still be quite close to Russia. As it turns out, Russia proved to be the aggressor. And when the first boots were on Ukrainian soil from Russian military in 2014 in Crimea, the West did nothing. And it was shameful and it was shocking. And the problem with living in a democracy is that you and I both know, and probably everyone watching now knows, that had we sent troops over and confronted Russia in Crimea, there would have been thousands of people on the street worried about a nuclear war, worried about confrontation, another war in a faraway place, a repetition of Iraq, not actually looking at the facts and just being so fearful and so anti-war. I mean, is anyone pro-war apart from a very small minority of pretty stupid hotheads? I don't think so. But from experience, from history, you know that if you do nothing, the problem only gets worse. And it has got so much worse. Had we sent in just one battalion of US, UK, or NATO troops into Crimea at the behest of the Ukrainian government to protect its sovereign territory, there would have been no problem. I still argue vehemently, even at the start of this war, we've virtually got to the state now where NATO is almost providing complete protection of the skies for Ukraine, and with 3 more Irises to come, with a few more systems from the US and the UK as well, we'll probably get to that state without planes. But had the week before, when the intelligence was given by the US, had Ukraine pleaded and asked for NATO, US, EU, UK to help monitor its skies, had they voluntarily closed the airspace, excuse me, and asked for NATO to make sure that there was clear skies, then I don't think this invasion would have happened. There may have then subsequently been the problem that a lot of people saying, oh, Ukraine's been taken over by the West, Western weapons, they weren't needed, Russia was never going to invade. We saw a lot of influential people having to eat humble pie who'd promised that Russia wouldn't invade, when of course they did. But even in the first day of the war, even then, had it been made clear that Ukraine had asked for assistance and we'd supplied assistance with real defensive weapons that could have helped, including patrolling the skies. I mean, if we'd have sent over a couple of fighter jets, would Russia have shot them down? Had they done so, then all the Russian attacking and defensive positions around the border would have been obliterated. And I don't think Putin would have taken that risk. It's difficult. It's a horrendous situation to be in, to ask a pilot to go out to patrol the skies knowing they might be shot down. Yeah. But had we done it, would it have saved 10,000, 15,000, 150,000 lives? Possibly, we don't know.
There are these rumors that Ukrainian pilots are being trained up in the US. Are they being trained up on US NATO jets? Are we going to be sending in main battle tanks to support Ukraine? Because right from the beginning it was this idea that we can't do that, escalate it, and then Russia escalated it. So we're like, okay, we'll do that, and Russia didn't do anything, and then we wait a bit more and like, okay, we'll give this type of armament. No, that's okay. And then a few months later, we'll give this type of armament. So we keep inching further and further forward and giving more and more. So really the next sort of step is these more offensive type of munitions and armaments. And you wonder whether that will happen. I mean, do you think we'll ever get to a point where we will be providing them with planes and tanks?
Yes. In a word, yeah. Why didn't we do this in February? This was an illegal invasion of a peaceful country. Ukraine has never invaded any country. It sent a few troops for UN peacekeeping forces. That's it. It's never been a threat to Russia. How can a country the size of Ukraine be a threat to Russia? Why didn't the civilized Western allied powers come to the aid to protect a sovereign territory that was crying out for help, that was on the early stage of the NATO path and an alliance of NATO? I just can't understand why we more or less let them say, well, get on with it. Here's a few manpads, here's a few missiles that will just keep you going for a while, a few javelins. At least the UK tried early on. The others were so slow to react, really. And would it have changed the course of the war? I firmly believe it would have done. And I firmly believe it would have saved tens of thousands of lives.
I did a video on this, and I wrote an article on it actually about how there is a theory. I was just playing around with the idea that that they were purposefully not giving them enough to string this war out long enough that it properly debilitates Russia on a very long-term basis. And in fact, Lloyd Austin said this back in April, it was, where he said, we want to degrade Russia long-term. And the only way you degrade them long-term is actually by having a very long, protracted battle that takes a war that takes out their entire capability and capacity. And so therefore it could be on purpose that they're not like ATACMS. They need these long range missiles. Don't give them yet. Just wait for everything to get like degraded as much as possible. And then that'll be the next stage. And then after this all happens, Russia just have nothing.
Yeah, I mean, that's the situation now, because I don't think you can guarantee security while Russia has enough attacking weapons, manpower, trained personnel to not invade again. So I think that's incredibly important, that now when a peace deal is inevitably reached, hopefully when all Russians have left Ukrainian land, that they're not in a position to rebuild. But also we need to be very mindful for the future not to fill Russians with hatred, as the mistakes of World War I and the settlements there could easily be repeated. So we need to try to get rid of ultra-nationalism, Nazism in Russia, and we need to try to make sure that people are helped to establish a society which is more equitable, that is more outward-looking. And we can only do that if there is a change, a wholesale change, not just in leadership, but in the entire ranks of the corrupt that have any hope. I mean, the pipe dream would be some sort of coalition between Navalny, I don't like his politics, but he is anti-corruption, and populist with a large section of the younger society. Kasparov coming back to the country, living in exile in the US, and an incredibly intelligent and respected man. Khodorkovsky, again, don't agree with all his sentiments, but true Russians and true passionate Russians. But that's a pipe dream. That's probably never.
I mean, this guy Neil Russell says, strange thing, when I was in Moscow in 2011, I could not find a single pro-Putin person who was below 60 years old. Putin's return was despised. So what happened to them all? You'll find that there's a massive difference between Moscow and the rest of Russia. So Moscow is really kind of liberal, elitist, urban kind of. It's same sorry.
And Peter also, St. Petersburg also.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, St. Petersburg and Moscow, very similar, very much. And this is the same the world over. So fascism tends to breed in rural, or at least appealing to the rural first. There's a big divide politically. You can look in the US and the UK. You look at a political map. UK is almost all blue, and the red parts are in the cities, and the vice versa in America. It's all red, and the blue parts are in the cities, because there's a huge difference between the politics of the rural and the large metropolitan areas. So that would, I think, largely explain that, and plus a load of brainwashing. We've got under 10 minutes left. So, and thank you so much for this, Tim. So if you have any questions, get them in now, any super chats, anything like that, always appreciated. Yes, this was an interesting question. What happens in Russia after Putin's death? I honestly think that, and this is what you were just saying then, which is you would hope for some kind of political coalition. But do you think that China will take an opportunistic position? And
yeah, it's interesting you mentioned China, didn't you? I think China's really happy at the moment to be neutral, to be perceived as not upsetting the US, but also staying close to Russia. But they haven't actually supported Russia very well at all. Also, remember, a lot of people do forget that China has historical claims on a lot of the far east of Russia, and a lot of people predicted a conflict there at some stage in the future. And for China's point of view, they're just sat there rubbing their hands, really, while the West and the East of Europe just ends up spending a whole load of weapons, a whole load of money, and a whole load of lives. The West will still be strong. Russia will be infinitely weaker. But China's probably quite happy to see the both societies at war, and them to be sat on the sidelines, really.
Eating popcorn and picking out the pieces. That's a really good point, because actually, even though China might be ideologically more aligned in some respects, although it's really difficult to see that Putin is somehow communist at all, or even China, arguably, these are all kind of like bastardized versions thereof. This is more of a corporatocracy of corporatism in an oligarchy in Russia. But China there's people in Russia worry that it will become a vassal state of China because it will be economically screwed over and will need the help of China. And China's in that position where it's probably quite happy for Russia to be taken apart in this war. It can then go, right, there's huge amounts of natural resources that we can stake a claim to in helping Russia get back on its feet, and actually we'll have our finger in all of Russia's pies.
Yeah, completely. And I think that's a very good point, because while the Russians who are ill-educated, the ones who are vehemently anti-Western and taken in by this brainwashing, won't change their mind overnight, and the education system will be aimed at their children and grandchildren rather than them. While they still have that utter pathological hatred, they don't have that hatred of China, so they're far more likely to accept them into a role within society and support to rebuild the cities. We've seen China already practice this quite successfully in many African nations and some Asian nations as well. So it is something that I'm sure the US is aware of. I don't know how we come into that. And to ask the earlier problem, do we confiscate all their atomic weapons, I think was one of the questions. I don't think it's possible to do that. I really don't. I don't think you can emasculate a country without its willingness to do so. Ukraine willingly gave them up. And I don't think Russians, no matter who comes to charge, even the most liberal, would know they would need to keep nuclear weapons, not for their security, but to maintain that they stay in power and there's no counter-revolution against whichever liberal democracy was to come to the fore. So I don't see us, sadly, getting rid of all Russia's nuclear capability.
So how do you see this ending? And just by the way, parts white say I have a Russian work colleague in tertiary education in New Zealand that believes Putin propaganda and still supports the war. Go figure. It's amazing how the tendrils of propaganda, how far they can reach, and if you're susceptible. I talked about this in a previous video. Go and check my previous Ukraine War extra videos where I talk about motivated reasoning. You end up at a conclusion if you want to reach that conclusion, right? It's all about people don't often build up evidence towards a conclusion. They adapt the conclusion and then they look for evidence to support that. That's called post hoc rationalization. Mm-hmm. Just be really wary of that. And I would imagine that would be a prime example there. Someone wanting to believe in Putin and therefore finding the evidence of propaganda to support that.
And anyway, they think the same of us right now, Jonathan. Yeah. They think exactly the same, that we're misguided and we're being lied to.
Absolutely. So how do you see this ending? What do you? I guess there's two questions here. What do you think will happen, and B, what do you think Ukraine should do, and is their best chance?
Well, the best chance is if we as a collective West support without any restriction and get this war over and done with as quickly as possible, and that would push Russia back, not just to the 23rd of February boundaries, but out of all the annexed claimed territories, including Crimea. Whether in such a circumstance, if there's a negotiated settlement, Russia could still have its fleet there for the rest of the initial term or the last signed term, that's a possibility. You've got to make some allowance, and you can't just punish a nation because, as I said earlier, it will replicate what happened between the First and the Second World Wars. The war will not end while Putin is in power. I think that's pretty certain now. So it's whether he is pushed out internally or whether he dies naturally. It is what comes. At the moment, there's no succession planning there, and it's not like going into Iraq and being criticized, or Libya and saying that we didn't have an exit plan. We cannot solely in the West have an exit plan. We can have some ideals and some wishes, but they're very likely not to come to fruition. All the West can concentrate at the moment on is helping Ukraine to liberate all its sovereign territory and to make sure that it cannot happen again in the immediate future. And then hoping that society in Russia wakes up with a combination of antagonism and dissent about the number of body bags that have come home. Hopefully people start reporting that as a collective. The mothers groups become a little bit more vocal, and
especially with those mobilized troops who there's already this aura of dissent, and if you can fuel that with the reality of body bags coming home, then and
we may see a revolution in some of the states like Dagestan, I mean Chechnya even. ruled by a lunatic. I think we can call him that quite safely, Kadyrov. I mean, just look back at his history, look back at his father, who swapped sides in the wars. He was vehemently anti-Putin, anti-Russian imperialism, and then suddenly, with a bit of money, became leader of New Chechnya as part of the Russian Federation. Go figure. So his son's following in his father's footsteps. So these places are all tinderboxes and rule with a rod of iron. When Russia is weak, as they are becoming now, then I think a few opportunists will see the opportunity to liberate their territories, they say. I mean, Chechnya wanted a revolution, Chechnya wanted independence, and was forcibly put down in the most heinous way. And no talk of a referendum there from Putin, was there, in the early stages? In fact, he used the Second Chechen War to get himself elected at the start of the 21st century. So I don't think we know an exit plan for Russia. I think that's got to play out domestically. There are ways and means that we can help that, and there are ways and means that we can help free internet access. VPNs even have been banned in Russia. So I think it's just this trying to drip feed into Russian society and trying to educate all those who have fled. And hopefully they will be able to return home and spread the truth and say, look, this is really what happens. Hopefully the number of people who've lost relatives in a stupid, needless war will also have had enough, and eventually there'll be such a weight that even post-Putin will actually get someone more moderate and someone who's willing to accept that mistakes were made by the previous regime.
And of course, there's already been an element of that opportunism with Armenia and Azerbaijan, Tajikistan and Uzbekistan, Tajikistan. Anyway, there are issues on the borders of those countries. So, which is to say, Russia is weak. Now's the time to strike and to fulfill. So, Georgia would be a great one, as you say, in Chechnya. Is there? So, thank you. That's our hour, and I really appreciate the time that you spent with me here. Are there any sort of final things you'd like to say? How to just kind of wrap up this? I mean, so goodness me, we didn't even talk about nuclear war, chemical warfare. We didn't talk about all the stuff that's going on in the different areas in the Kherson and up in the Svatove area. There's so much happening at the moment, and then now the last day, it seems to have suddenly sort of started kicking into motion with the counterattacks of the Ukrainians. So lots to talk about that we haven't talked about, but thank you so much for what you have said. What sort of final pieces do you want to add?
We can do it again, by all means. Give it a little bit of time, and if people want it, write in the comments and I'll come back on, not a problem.
Yeah, I'd love that, Tim.
I don't think we will get to nuclear war, East v West. Do I rule out a nuclear strike by Russia in Ukraine? Absolutely not. I think it's definitely a strong possibility. I won't say it's likely, but I do think it is a possibility. And how the world reacts if and when that happens, or whether the US intelligence and the Five Eyes intelligence manages to, because they do have very good sources inside Russia at the moment, clearly, and manages to take action to prevent that should it happen, then hopefully that would be the case. But I do fear that a so-called tactical nuke could be unleashed on a Ukrainian city, and just this nonsense at the moment without any using fake photographs, for instance, as I outlined yesterday, to try to pretend that they discovered some things happening in one of the Kiev nuclear power plants. It's just laughable.
It's like that X-ray. It's like the X-ray of the lorry that was just the wrong lorry. It's just so many. But it's about flooding the information space with all these like narratives, and you just don't know what's true. I quite like the idea, but it's quite feasible. So the Sun, of all newspaper media outlets, said that Putin could drop a tactical nuke in the Black Sea, and I thought actually that's quite clever. Like if I was Putin, I'd be like, right, I can do nuclear, but I'm not going to do it in such a way that will incur the wrath of everyone, and it could start. But if I do it in a way that makes everyone go, "Oh, dude, like he's half done it. He's done it in a sea, in the Black Sea," or is that enough? Do we react? Do you know what I mean? Like that, I could imagine that being quite clever, but or not, or it might be
not so good for his own fleet, really, which is large part of their own defensive abilities. But no, yeah, it's an interesting point, but I do fear for Ukraine for that. I mean, it would have to be. I don't think it would be in Mykolaiv and Kherson, because it's too close to Crimea, and it would just further east as well. I think somewhere seemingly innocuous in the west, Ivano-Frankivsk or Vinnytsia or something like that. He may just, as an end game, knowing there's no way out, his last gamble, his only joker left in the pack is the nuclear option. And he does believe that intimidation works and people back down. And he's surprised that we haven't backed down at this moment. And even France and Germany and Italy have been strong hitherto. He hoped that the new Meloni government in Italy would have a change of heart. They're still strong, thankfully. And there's no way that Ukraine will lose this war if we stay united. And hopefully we're approaching not the end game, but maybe the start of the road to the end game. And possibly in early 2023, the winter easing will allow more movement and the final push to get rid of Russia from all Ukrainian territory if they are still in at that point.
Excellent. Well, look, thank you so much. Thank you to the very lively chat this side. Lots that we could have talked about, of course, as ever. Really appreciate your feedback and your support. And thanks, Tim. And I would absolutely love to do this again. It's been a nice chat and so much more to say. So I will stay in touch.
May I just say that there have been so many comments we haven't managed to get through. If people do want to write to me on Twitter, my address is on the screen there, my handle, then I do try to answer all comments, as I think you know as well. And people can follow me there and follow you as well. But thanks, it's been a pleasure. Thanks to everyone who's watched and contributed. And see you again sometime soon.
Brilliant. Well, look, guys, as ever, question everything and just be aware of the destruction of our own democratic institutions. Just as we look at Ukraine and Russia, just be aware of our own sacred institutions and make sure that we look after them, because the freedom and democracy is super important. Anyway, Toodle Pips, thanks everybody, and thanks so much to Tim. Follow him on Twitter; he's an excellent source of information, and hopefully you will see us have a chat again. Toodle Pips.